Alright, I wanted to make this video to address some of the misinformation out there regarding Warden, specifically how it works, what it brings to the table, and what its intended roles are. This video is going to be aimed at new and returning players mainly, and anyone generally interested in Warden. The aim being to give new players real information about how the class is going to perform in group content rather than just how it should work on paper. But for the most part, it's going to be primarily focused on tanking and general use, but I'll have a small DPS section later in the video. I will also not be focusing on gear to prolong the relevance of this video as the game changes with updates, but I will talk about gear philosophy later in the video and what should be prioritized. There will be timestamps in the description for anyone who wants to skip around. Why am I making this video? Well, in the last year, since the Warden rework, apparently most people in the game these days basically don't know anything about how Warden works, what it can do, or why they should have one in the group. This has led to a lot of groups not taking newer players, claiming Warden can't perform X role or isn't good enough for X instance. In the last year, I've talked to hundreds of people regarding Warden and its current state, and I've helped with teaching for in the realm of about 30 to 60 new and returning Wardens, of which the most common complaint I hear from them, other than the lag of course, is groups won't even give them a chance. I personally have not had this issue, but I believe that to be because everyone in Evernight knows who I am. And around the time of the Warden rework, there was a lot of anti-Warden stigma going on. No one was really willing to take a Warden in the group at that time, so hopefully this video can help with that in some way. I will be having IRL issues soon and will have to step away from the game for the foreseeable future, so this will be my final contribution to the community. So first of all, for new players, I just want to explain here my setup and why I do things the way I do. So you've probably noticed that I have my 9 masteries and I play them horizontal, a bit like a piano. Most people play them vertical in a 3x3 brick, and I should show that here in a second. The reason that I do this is just because I think and act better horizontally. That's just how I work. And I have my input overlay over on the left side of the screen so you can see what keys I'm pressing. So it's not confusing. I want to explain that the right half of my keyboard, so basically 5 to the right, I have bound to mouse keys, and everything left of that I'm doing with my left hand. So I'm using both of my hands at the same time. So I don't want it to be confusing for someone to think that I'm reaching all the way to the other end of my keyboard with my hand, because that is not what is happening here. So as you see down at the bottom here, I have a 3x3 block of all 9 masteries, and for the most part, this is how most people play Warden in some variation or another. Ultimately, it's going to come down to your comfort and how you want to have it set up. So I need to just stress to you that you need to be comfortable hitting all 9 of these if you're going to play this class, because later down the road, if you have put some of them off to the side and you don't use them that much, it's just going to hurt you down the road. In group content, either tanking or DPS, you are going to use all 9 of these regularly, every single fight, with no exceptions. You will use all 9 of them, so don't train your muscle memory to ignore some of them. It's just going to hurt you later down the line. Now, I just want to make it clear, just because I play horizontal does not mean you should play horizontal. It is going to be case by case. Everyone needs to do what works for them, and it has to be completely comfortable. And I also want to stress to you that don't start thinking of them as shortcuts to certain gambits. Think of them more like building blocks to build what you want to build. Because if you start thinking of them as shortcuts as you get more experience, you're going to rely on specific sequences to get to the gambits you want, and you're subconsciously not going to realize that there are more ways to get to the finish line, so to speak. So I can demonstrate that here. Basically, the skill Dark Before Dawn, which is the power restore, you are going to use this regularly and often, and there are numerous ways to build it. So, say for example, you've gotten used to building for me, it's control 2, control 3, control 1. That's one way for me to do it. But there are more ways to do that. So you could do one builder, and then for me, C4, and then what I have bound to 6. And that is another way to build it, and there's many different ways to do it. And you need to be able to build it comfortably multiple ways, because you're not always going to have the proper masteries available to build it, and you're going to have a situation where you're out of power and nearly about to die, and you're not going to be able to recover because you haven't trained in your muscle memory the different ways to build different gambits. For any new players or anyone that are returning to the game and haven't played Warden in a long time, if you want to improve using your masteries and figure out what setup works best for you, I recommend you just sit down, preferably in front of something like a training dummy, and just practice for a little bit. And once you find something that's comfortable and you like how it is, I recommend you just stick with it and train on it for the future, because if you keep changing it around, you're just going to keep breaking up that muscle memory. This setup that I have right here, the horizontal, I've been doing this for as long as I can remember, like going back to when Warden was even added to the game. So it is completely ingrained in my muscle memory. I can play it without looking at the screen whatsoever. And ideally that's where you want to be, but that is not required at all for you to perform on the class. Now, as far as your priorities go while tanking, for those who have played Warden before the Warden rework, you know that historically you had different buffing gambits that typically increased things like block, parry, and evade, and increased aggro generation, things like that. With the rework, the point of it was to move majority of those buffs over to mitigation and damage reduction. So since the game has moved somewhat away from BPE system, most enemies just do guaranteed hits, and not a lot of them can be BPE'd anymore. So in order for Warden to stay relevant, if there aren't updates, every single update to how the class works, it needs to be based on what every other tank uses to survive, and that's hard mitigation, hard damage reduction, healing, things like that, things that aren't going to become obsolete if the game changes drastically. So the way Warden tanking works now, after the rework, is basically you're going to have these 6 buffs here on the left that are crucial for you to keep up, and now it depends on the situation. So if you're in a fight with only physical damage, you only need to technically do the physical ones, and if you're in a fight with only tactical, you only technically do the tactical ones. But most fights are dynamic and have lots of different damage sources, so it's typically good to keep all of them up if possible, and if you're practiced at it, it shouldn't be an issue. And I'll talk later about there's a couple ways to increase the durations of these to make it more manageable. And the 2 on the right are more BPE focused, and they're typically not prioritized before these 6 on the left, but once you have the chance to, you should get these up too, as these also make a tremendous difference in tanking, especially against things like trash pulls where BPE is more relevant. You'll see a large decrease in damage taken if you have all of these up all at the same time. Then the other part of Warden is its availability of healing, and even with a healer, you're going to be doing a large portion of the healing yourself, and it's very possible for you to out-heal the healer in terms of what you're healing yourself with. So there's a big juggling act that needs to happen here, where you need to manage these buffs and manage your self-healing and manage things like pulling mobs and the aggro and the force taunts, which I'll get to later, are also threat copies, and I'll explain what that means and how that works. But for the most part, it is crucial to your survival that you manage these buffs right here. If you let these fall while you're in a hard fight, there's an extremely good chance you're going to get one shot. So you are going to live and die off of these buffs right here. So here are your heals and your morale taps or morale saps. So the 4 on the top are your heal over times. You will want to have all 4 of these up as much as possible, if not 100% of the time, if you can manage it. these are just as critical as the buffs that I showed on the previous slide. These are going to keep you, even with a healer. There are situations where the healer will be expected to keep you up, but even with the healer, these are means of you keeping yourself alive, keeping your health up at full. If you let your health dip down too much, even if you know you're reasonably safe, any large hit could kill you. So keeping your health up at all times is very important, unless you really know what you're doing and you're going to cheese something like Never Surrender, which I'll talk about later. Now, the three on the bottom are your morale taps. So these did not get scaled up a whole lot as much as the healing over time did with the rework. I typically only use them if there's 6 or more targets, or I will use them if I need to generate a lot of aggro on mobs coming in quickly, because these are some of the sharper aggro generators right here. Resolution specifically can be used in a pinch if you have got a lot of mobs around you to very quickly put yourself back to full health, but typically if there's not a whole lot of enemies, these have very limited usefulness, so you shouldn't waste your time just burning these on one target. It's not worth it. Now, the one I have over here to the side, Celebration of Skill, this one is very niche. Most people don't even know it exists, but it, with the rework, is now just a burst heal one time and has limited usefulness, but it's very good if you chain it with other heals to very quickly push yourself back to full health. It can very much save you. If you drop low, you can quickly hit this with something else, which I'll show later, and you'll get a big burst heal. So there's lots of ways you can use these, but there's a specific rotation I have to the way I do the heal over times, and I'll show that in a second here. And I'll explain why I do it that way. So I always start with Restoration first, and the reason I do this is because this is your strongest baseline heal. It's very easy to keep up all the time. Main reason I have this rotation is from back before the Warden rework. The way these worked is basically if you did Persevere and Safeguard in order, you would get a passive buff that was hidden. It wasn't listed anywhere in the class, and your next restoration would be bigger. So I would start with Restoration for a baseline, do Persevere, Safeguard to get that buff, and then the next time I do Restoration, I would have a bigger cash out. And I also run Conviction at the same time. But the main big reason to keep all these going at the same time and in this order is because it makes them all tick very cleanly at the same time, and you get very sharp healing with it. So I'll show right here. So with the 4 of all these up at once, you'll see that they tend to all tick around the same time, and you're going to get a lot better results with your survivability doing this. A lot of people that I see that are just running one hot or just running them at random times, they say they're not strong enough, they're not keeping me alive, but if you do it this way, you're going to get a lot more of an immediate effect, and this is going to help you push yourself back to full health with incoming damage. Something I also want to mention is a lot of Wardens don't know how quick recovery works and what it's for, and like 9 times out of 10 when I do teaching, whoever I'm working with has never used this or doesn't know how it works. So basically, instead of having to build a gambit that kind of cuts itself off, needing to use a builder to connect it, you can use something like Shield or Fist, and then immediately pull back one of those 2 digits to immediately connect it, and then you just built that with no use of builders at all. And this is really where you want to be for doing group content, especially tanking, is because if you're using more than one builder at a time to connect your gambits, it's heavily slowing you down and limiting what you can do. And there are situations where you may not have time to use builders because they're very slow to get off, especially when you're running around and there's mechanics going on. So being able to build something like Conviction without needing to use a builder, without needing to stop, without needing a target, and using it to heal your group, keep group sustain going and move around is very, very important. And it's not just with that, it's also with something like restoration here. And there are times where you might need to run away from a boss for a second and have restoration ready and turn and immediately go into healing. Because if you have to stop and build it one icon at a time, you're probably going to be dead before you get it off. So very important that you be able to use all the tools available here. So everything on my bar down here, I aside from my mount, of course, I basically use everything here every fight. So before you start a boss fight, obviously you're going to want to buff up with the 6 buffs that I showed on the previous slide, and then depending on the situation, once you get a chance, 2 on the right. But the problem that I see a lot with newer players is that they buff up and they start the fight, and for that nearly minute and a half they do fine, and then in the middle of the fight they start to fall apart. And it's kind of like a tightrope situation where you get out in the middle and you start wobbling side to side, and if you're not practiced, you're not going to get to the other side. So you need to be able to very quickly re-up your buffs. And best way to do this that I found is you can either progressively do them over about 10 seconds as masteries are cycling, or you can use something like rapid techniques, and I typically save rapid techniques for this, just for re-upping in the middle of the fight. So to show that you can, within those 6 seconds, get all 6 of these buffs up very quickly if you know what you're doing. And that is basically the easiest way to get them back up in the middle of the fight. Now, rapid techniques. So this is one of the new skills with the Warden rework, and this is pretty much crucial to playing the class now. No matter what your rotation is, no matter if you're tanking or DPS, you're going to want to heavily use this, either for tanking, like I just showed, to re-up your buffs, and I'm going to show some other ways you can use it here, but also in DPS, this is probably how you're going to do your opening rotation, and this is how you're going to get all of your dots on the target within 44 seconds very fast, and I'll talk about that later. But just to show here, there are numerous ways to use rapid techniques. So it's not just for re-upping buffs, it can be for emergency, so like I need to get all my heals up really fast right now. And I can basically just spam the heals with the same exact masteries, and it's a very easy way to get these up really fast. That's a good emergency use of it. Another one is something like resounding challenge. To give you an example of a real world instance or raid, something like Doom of Karas Celebrin, there's lots of ads at all times running around all the time, and you're going to spend a lot of the time just in tanking in general using resounding challenge to pull aggro, because it's your farthest reaching aggro generator. It's kind of like war chant for Guardian. So there are situations where, for example in that raid, that if there's just mobs running all over the place, I need to just get control of everything right now, I could hit that and I could just spam it over and over and over and over again. And not just with that, but there's lots of ways to use resounding challenge. There's lots of different ways to build it. So resounding challenge especially, you really want to get comfortable building as many ways as possible, because you are going to use it frequently. Another example with rapid techniques, so you can see I can spam conviction multiple times in a row, and you may think that this isn't very efficient, and it's not, but if your sole priority is the survival of your group, and say something like the healer died, I have in the past saved wipes from happening just by doing that and spamming conviction. Especially if you build for conviction, you can get a lot of really large crits off conviction, and just being able to spam it over and over again like that, if say like you're doing a 3-man, you're doing 1 tank, 2 DPS. Well, now you're the healer, basically. So if one of the DPS gets knocked down really low, that's a real good way to push them back up to full again before they get hit by another force damage that would otherwise kill them and take them out of the fight and possibly lead to a wipe. Aggro. This is something that's very poorly understood now, and most people don't know how it works. So for a very long time, that system has been extremely simplified in this game. So you don't really need to fight for it anymore and constantly generate throughout fights. That's one of the biggest changes that older players coming back to the game are going to have to learn, is that the aggro system is extremely simple now, and it takes up very little of your time. So whereas before you would have to fight for it and keep generating it with constant gambits, now basically within a few seconds of starting the fight, you can completely solidify aggro for yourself, and you're basically never going to lose it. And there are exceptions to that, and it has to do with mechanics, but basically, in general, when you start the fight, good practice is start with something just like Resounding Challenge, and then typically the DPS is going to start hitting them and generate aggro, and then you do something like Warning Shot, and you wait a couple seconds, and then you use Defiant Challenge, and by that point, you're probably not going to lose aggro ever again. And if you really want to be safe, give it another Warning Shot. And Warning Shot has pretty much 10-second cooldown now. You can spam it as much as you want. A lot of people are kind of self-conscious, and I see them trading various threat modifiers because they think they need to fight for threat by spamming things over and over again, like Resounding Challenge. But the way Force Taunts work now, basically, is when you Force Taunt, it's a threat copy. Majority of Force Taunts are threat copies now. So you are going to basically take whatever the aggro was on the target, and it's going to become your aggro. So my favorite analogy is hunters when they do their buff up and burn hot Heartseeker from stealth that always generates so much aggro. And it can generate so much aggro that it can actually override your first force taunt. So I typically wait just a second after the fight starts. I'll soft aggro with something like Resounding Challenge just to get its attention. DPS will start up, and that's why I then go to Warning Shot, and that's going to immediately give me that aggro. And then a couple seconds later, when I follow up with Defiant Challenge, 99.9% of the time, I'm not going to lose it again. Unless there's another tank that's going to taunt it off me, you're not going to lose the aggro. And like I said, just use Warning Shot again if you're self-conscious about it. There's no harm in it. Another question I get a lot is, what do I do if there's many targets? And a good example of this is something like the bats on boss 4 of Gwathrenost. So when they come in, there's this huge shuffle basically to get control of them and which tank's going to take them and where they're going to tank them. So basically the way that works is if you're trying to control many targets quickly and you only have one AoE force taunt, basically, not including Desperate Shield, which we'll talk about later, but your main AoE force taunt is Defiant Challenge, and it's got a 30-second cooldown, so you have to be careful with it. Now, basically, you're going to soft aggro as much as you can in situations like that just to get its attention, and when you're finally ready to take it and really take it, and you're going to hold it somewhere, that's when you commit to using Defiant Challenge. So save this until the point when you're ready to completely take the mob somewhere else. While you're doing that shuffle with other tanks or the rest of the group or whatever, and you're trying to figure out who's taking what, which should already be worked out beforehand, by the way. But while all that's in motion, those first few seconds where they fly everywhere and target random people, the best way to get control of that is Resounding Challenge, because it has the longest range, and then when they get close, you can do something like Exaltation of Battle, and that's going to give you tons of aggro, and then when you're ready and you have them, then you do Defiant Challenge, and there should be no way you're going to lose them unless someone force taunts off of you. Another thing is, first of all, you shouldn't need aggro modifiers on Warden, specifically the ones that you trait or slot in like legendary items. I've found through testing that they basically don't really do that much. You don't need them. majority of what you're doing is going to revolve around force taunts and threat copies, which they're not going to change, basically. So, in all my time tanking, I have not needed to use threat modifiers. I have done just fine with what has been available to me. So, you don't really need to waste space on that. And I also need to mention that, specifically, the traits Redirect Ire and Undeniable Challenge for Warden, and we'll talk more about traits later, but these two specifically, this one I just basically don't have a use for. And the Deflection Gambit, I basically never use. It doesn't serve a purpose in this version of it to generate more aggro. You'll have no issue with that, just using Exaltation of Battle or Resounding Challenge. And this one, Undeniable Challenge, it's debatable whether it's actually bugged, but it's not working properly. And this has been allegedly confirmed with a GM, but basically, if you take this, your Resounding Challenge is going to be generating less aggro than the base version already is. So by taking this, you are just straight up harming yourself. There is no reason to take this. Now, these are your cooldowns. So, first of all, the 4 in the middle here, for the Free Peoples and Desperate Combat. The one on the top, 2 on the top are their base versions. And the 2 in the bottom here are what they look like when you have 3 stacks of Advanced Technique. And that is the tiers you stack up as you use Gambits. So, ideally, you want to only spend these when you've hit tier 3, but there are exceptions to this for emergencies. Now, Desperate Combat, you typically want to get off as early as possible, and I'll talk more about that on its own and how it works. And for the Free Peoples, this is Warden's Group Protect, basically. So, for the group, it comes out to around 20% damage reduction, and for you, it's more like 44% damage reduction, and that's if you cash it out at tier 3. So that's typically the thing you want to save for force damage phases of fights. So like if you know there's about to be a lot of damage coming to the group, this is what you'd save it for, basically, to prevent someone from getting one shot. And as you can see from the base version of For the Free Peoples here at the top, even at tier 1, it's pretty potent for you. So if you need to use it early in the fight, that's doable. Now, the 2 on the left, Never Surrender and Restorative Shield Work. Restorative Shield Work is with the Tracery for tanking legendary items. You can get the cooldown very low, 57 seconds. It functions a bit like both of a BPE skill, kind of like Guardian has, and it's also a heal. So, as long as you get hit 5 times during the course of it within 10 seconds, you're going to heal 50% of your health. So this is a really good combination to use even if you're fighting something that can't be BPE'd. This is a really good way to put yourself back at full health. Just hitting this, basically you're going to heal 50% over the next 5 or so seconds. It's very useful. Never Surrender has a lot of bugs associated with it and problems now since the rework, and it always has over the years, but in its current iteration right now, it's a bit like a poor man's last stand for Captain. So the way it's supposed to work is if you drop below 5%, you heal, and with all the other heals going on, it usually should put you around full health. And you'll get 10% mitigation for about 10 seconds, and it'll reduce your shield healing. But with the Tracery, you get incoming healing back, so it kind of negates that debuff out. Now the problem with this skill is that there's a lot of things that can go wrong with it. It can, I've seen it just simply not go off and you just die when it's on. I've seen it heal basically a couple percent of my health when I have no other debuffs on me and just does nothing. I've seen it not go off and tell me I died to fall damage. It's got a lot of complications with it, and it's a shame because you kind of need to rely on this skill with Warden now. All of these cooldowns, basically, in harder fights, you want to kind of have cycling and moving at all times, so you've always kind of got one available. The way Never Surrender is right now, basically, you want to let yourself intentionally drop to low health, and basically, you can walk into a puddle to do this and get damaged. And I have healers say to me all the time, "What's wrong with you? Why did you just walk over that puddle?" Or "Why are you sitting on 5?" It's because I'm trying to get this to go off. And it's important that if you're going to work with the same group often, that you instruct your healers to understand that if you're sitting at 5% health trying to die, you're trying to get this to go off. And tell them not to heal you until it goes off. And there will be a big flaming spear above your head that spins that tells you when it goes off. Because most healers don't understand how this works, and they can actually get you killed if they try to heal you while you're at low health and you're trying to get this off. Because if you use this and it doesn't go off, you're pretty much screwed. So sometimes it's better to just let Never Surrender go off early if you decide you need a cooldown. And then after it goes off, once those 10 seconds of extra mitigation are gone, go into tier 3 of For the Free Peoples. And as you chain these all together, you can get a very long duration of protection. And another thing to mention is For the Free Peoples gets reset by Minstrel's Call to Greatness skill. So if you coordinate with your group, you can potentially have 40 seconds of group protection up, which is very powerful. And now last over here, way of either spear, shield, or fist. This is basically your last resort. There's not a whole lot of reason to use this. It's not that powerful in anything. It's more useful in red, ironically, even though it also still doesn't do that much. Main reason to use this is when everything else here is on cooldown and you want to trigger that tier 3 incoming damage buffs. This is a way to cash that out, and you could potentially do that as long as you need to until everything else comes off cooldown. Desperate Combat. So this skill, you typically want to get this off as soon as possible in the fight once you have 3 stacks of advanced technique. If it works as intended, it should stay up until it comes off cooldown again. So, starting off with Desperate Spear, you get 4 charges when you cash it out at tier 3. With Desperate Spear, each debuff lasts 10 seconds. Now, you can stack them all at once, and it comes to about 30-some seconds. Now, if you want the maximum duration out of this, which is 40 seconds, you have to wait until it goes off every 10 seconds and then reapply it. If you put it on and let it tick down and then try to reapply it before it's expired, it will eat it and you will lose the charge completely. So you either need to stack all 4 at once, or you need to wait every 10 seconds to keep reapplying it for 40 seconds duration. Typically you'll want to do this during like a burn phase of a boss when the captain does Oathbreaker or something like that, and you want this debuff up at the exact same time. And that is going to greatly increase the amount of damage the boss takes. Now, the other ones, so these correspond to your last gambit use. If you use a spear, you'll get spear. If you use a shield, you get shield. If you use fist, you'll get fist. So Desperate Shield, this is AoE taunt and an AoE heal per target. So if you hit a lot of targets with this, this can put you back to full health very easily. And it's also Force Taunt, so if for whatever reason Defiant Challenge does not work because there's a lag spike or because the weird geometry that developers put in the instances caused it not to hit the mobs or whatever happened, you have potentially 4 more spammable Force Taunts right here to get control of the situation again. So this was a very nice addition, and the Fist version is basically just a stun. So if you want to AoE stun, similar to how Guardian does, this is how you do it. Just understand that you need to have it prepared in advance. It's not something you can really get to very fast if you suddenly decide you need it. You need to be prepared to use it in advance if you want to get it off. This is also very useful for interrupting swarm enemies that all channel at the exact same time. This is very good for interrupting all of them in conjunction with something like a Lore Master doing Bane Flare or whatever. So, traits. Now, for the most part, you're just going to fill out blue and yellow for tanking. Obviously, you'll want Persevere Healing. You'll want the extra DR for the buffs. you'll want Defiant Challenge. You'll need to put 1 at least into Warcry to advance to the next tier. The 5% critical protection, you don't really need this. Just if you want to use it, use it. Again, DR buff here. This, with the last stat changes, Warden, for whatever reason, has almost no evade, despite being an evade class. So this is really good to spec into. So you'll get much more block and parry out of it. Unassailable, this is for more buff duration. You'll want this as well as the Tracery, which I will show in a bit. This is to get your buffs as long as possible, so you have less to manage. This, some people don't take this, but again, increase the buffs of basically Persevere and the healing of Persevere, so that alone makes it worth the take. This is shield healing, obviously you'd want to take that. Heal over time pulses, yes. Never surrender cooldown, you're going to end up beating that. The reason I don't take the morale tap damage and healing here is because, like I said earlier, I only use it on 6+ targets, and it hasn't been scaled up as well as it could have been. So I don't see a huge amount of use in it. I don't need to have 5 points into this. It's not going to get you killed if you don't have this. So for the free peoples, obviously you'll want that. You'll want Fellowship Protector as well. That's for the being able to do a constant group protect every time you cash out 3 tiers. And the passives, obviously all of these are useful. Now, Close Call specifically, this is something that a lot of people are upset about because Warden no longer has very much evade, so this is not going off very much, but people have been acting as though this is, without this, Warden can't tank anymore and all hope is lost, and that is not true. This, even before Warden lost all its evade and the stat changes, this did very little, and it's not that important, and if you're relying on this to tank, you're doing it wrong. And the rest of these are just more buffs to add on to the 6 buffs that you're keeping up in the background. This one right here, every time you spend tier 3, that's where the 12% is coming from. Any way you spend tier 3, you are going to get the 12% cash out, and if you just keep repeating tiers and not spending it, you're going to continuously get 4% incoming damage there. And here is just pulses to morale taps, and here's where you get desperate combat from. Now, in yellow, this is rating buffs for buffs, basically. You don't technically need this, I just find it useful. Everything helps. Mark targets, you can skimp on the duration of these. You can pull some points out of these if you want. This is for your marked and diminished mitigation buff, which we'll talk about in a bit. So this is a 60-second duration if you have all 5 ranks of this, but you can take some out and have a shorter duration and just reapply it more often, and that works if you want to save points. Bullseye, you want to have 5 ranks of this because it will give you critical chance. More critical chance means more critical healing. You're going to have way better survivability. The finesse is going to completely depend on your build. You may not need any. You may want all of it. It's up to you. Battering strikes in tank, yes, you should have this. This is very useful. This helps the group a lot, and I'll show this buff later, or debuff rather. And it's very easy to keep up at the 3rd tier in tank. Strong foundations, you should always have this, always, no matter what. This just makes using the masteries much easier. This is debuff duration. You don't technically need this, it just makes your life a lot easier. Again, just like these two, you can skimp on the duration a little bit to save some points. Suppression, you should always have this. You're going to apply this very easily, and that's going to reduce the outgoing damage of mobs. Javelin of Deadly Force, this is incredibly useful. You should have this. This is how you are going to apply marked and diminished AoE to everything in front of you, basically. This is extremely good skill. In red, it is a decent burst as well. Snapshot, this one is hit or miss. In blue, so it doesn't go off that often in blue, but it's worth to have because it resets javelin skills, and if you get a bunch of resists or something, you can reapply them immediately, and it helps. Fire at will. This is very useful. Again, something you'd use like during an Oathbreaker burn. This helps the group do more damage, basically. And this one right here, this is the only way you're going to get basically an in-combat sprint on Warden, similar to Guardian's Charge. If you want to be able to in-combat sprint, you're going to have to use this, even though it's very janky, and I'll explain how it works when we get there. And then here's rapid techniques. You should always have this regardless of your build, always. Now, to answer why I didn't take certain things here, or why I did certain things, basically, I explained earlier, redirect ire and undeniable challenge, basically worthless, and I explained why I don't take this. Now, over here, these four right here, you have basically no use for range damage in tanking. This light damage, you don't need it for tanking. The attack duration and assailment, if you plan on being an assailment often, that's fine, but it's not going to be a huge deal. Throwing arm, this, you might find a niche use for this if a fight comes along where you want to play an assailment at a really long range and range tank from a really long range. This could potentially be useful. And this one, you don't really have a whole lot of use for this in tank. Even if Javelin of Deadly Force resists and the debuffs on it resist, you can just reapply it again with the boot line and with the precise strike line, so there's really no need to have this. Now, legendary items. So, as far as tanking is concerned, I see no reason to really use anything other than this. So, I have first of all, you are going to want the crafted heraldries with the sets on them, because you're able to potentially have multiple 2 sets if you want. So here, on both legendary items, I have the physical one and the tactical one for 1.5% overcap on mitigation, and I'll talk about that in the next section at some point, properly stacking mitigation to tank. But then I've got the incoming damage reductions. Those are always passive, they always help. Healing over time, that's obvious. And I have the morale tap damages on here, despite the fact I don't use the traits, just because why not? And shield tactics immunity duration. So that's one of the things with when you're doing your buffs, you may want to move shield tactics to the end of your buffing, so you can have the longest immunity duration, basically anti-stun, when you go into if it's like a trash pull with mobs that spam stun, or a boss that has stuns or whatever, when you can't get stunned, you use this right before it to get the maximum duration out of it. And marked and diminished potency, every Warden should have this always, no matter the build. This is crucial to the class right now. Steadfast cooldown, this is mainly a tank thing. This is just to reduce the cooldown of your CC break, and that is always useful. Restorative shield work cooldown, that is to reduce it down to 57 seconds. Very useful. Will keep you alive in longer, harder fights. Here we have another shield gambit buff duration. So, as many sources as you could possibly find. So basically the traits and this you want to get your buffs as long as possible, so you don't have to manage them so often. And here I have Grand Willpower, which goes with the heraldries to get the 2 set. And then I have 2 perfect healings, and that is to get the 3% overcap outgoing healing. That's very flexible. You can run whatever you want, and it's not having the 2 of these is not going to get you killed. It's just that's what I prefer. I do a lot of healing, so I like to have more healing. But whatever you want to put there, you can put there. And up here, we've got base morale multiplier. This is kind of something you should just always have in a tank. It just, in general, increases your base morale pool, and that's always useful. And incoming heal bonus, I tested this slot with a lot of different things. I basically tried everything I could slot there to see what worked best, and this has ended up being what was the most useful. I did a lot of testing with the heal over time crits, and At times it was very useful and potent, but other times you don't crit and it's basically worthless. So I found that the incoming healing modifier was the best used here. Then we have Never Surrender duration, and this also has the buff on it that negates the debuff from Never Surrender. So if you're going to be tanking, you're going to want this because you want Never Surrender to last as long as possible. If it turns off before you drop below 5%, it's going to kill you basically. Shield Gambit healing, yes, another thing. Even if you're in red, pretty much every Warden should have this because it's always useful for healing. Mastery cooldown, obviously, another morale tap legacy here. And heal bonus for conviction, again, always useful. I use this in red as well. It's just always useful to have bigger conviction for group healing. And I put this here because I didn't really have anything else I wanted. Gambit debuff duration. This is just, again, going to add to your debuff durations and just make your life easier. And then grand armor for the other two set. Now to talk about gear. So first of all, I just want to say I am not focusing this video on any specific update, like what gear you should use, what's best in slot, whatever, because the game changes every update, and these numbers are going to change as time goes on, and it's just going to make this video obsolete in the future. So to prolong the relevancy of this video, I'm going to talk about what you want to aim for every update and whenever gear changes. For the most part, for as long as this game has existed, going back to 2007, for the most part, your priorities here have not majorly changed. The ways you get some of these stats have changed and the caps have changed, but what you want to prioritize per build hasn't very much changed. So that should stay the same. So that's what we're going to talk about here. I also need to say that there's a big misconception that a lot of people have, and I mean a lot of people have, and I see it every time I'm logged into the game and someone talks about it in world chat and they don't understand how these work. So where it says caps percent up here and down this list, these are not the hard caps for these stats. These are the rating caps for these stats. So the rating in your character panels you get, these are what they cap out at. With a couple exceptions here, these are not the hard caps for what you can get these to. So for mitigation example, I see people say so often when somebody asks what is the cap for whatever, and they'll just repeat basically what's here, and they'll say, oh, it's 40, 50, 60. No, it's not. That is the rating cap. You can get this much higher, especially on a tank, and I'm going to talk about that here in a second specifically. If you try to tank with just these stats here, they're in harder content, you're just going to get one shot. That is not how it works, and I'm going to explain how to properly stack mitigation here in a second. For tanking, your offensive stats don't matter a whole lot for a pure tanking build. We're not talking about hybrid here right now. So critical rating does have a bit of a use for tanking. With bullseye in yellow, you're probably going to be sitting around 10%, and that's fine. This does help with crit healing, but you shouldn't really focus on it or slot it over anything else. Finesse, this is going to depend on you. Personally, me, I have not had a problem working between 19 and 24% finesse. I haven't had excessive resists or anything. If you do resist, it's very easy to just reapply your debuffs again. There's nothing is really lost forever on Warden. If you get a resist, you can just do it again. It seems like everybody has a different experience with finesse. I know some people stack like 35% and still get BPE and resists, so it's going to depend on you and your experience. Damage, this is all pretty much skipped while tanking. Now, outgoing healing rating, this is very useful to Warden tank. Now, there's two main ways you can build right now in this current update I'm making this video in, and that is you can build agility, and you're going to end up with more healing, and you're going to end up with more parry and block. Now, you can also build will instead, and that's what most other tanks are doing, and that is going to give you more resist and more finesse. So, it's up to you which way you want to do it. I personally wanted more healing, so I went with agility. And in this update, I ended up with around 40 or so percent with an agility build, and I tested stacking more outgoing healing and extra essence slots, and I got up to like 50 and 60%, and it does help, but it's not hugely needed. The way Warden heals work is they are scaled more in the code side, done by the developers, so they're going to be rather potent regardless of what you do. So you don't necessarily need to stack this to get decent healing. It just helps. So if you have to lose some of this and go to health stacking, which is what I went back to, I pulled all the extra outgoing healing out of my build because I didn't think it was necessary, and I went back to morale stacking just because having a high health pool is just universally useful no matter what you do. But it's ultimately up to you how you want to do this. Resist, as I said, if you go with a will build, your resist is going to be much higher when you come out on the end. If you go with an agility build, this is going to be very low. I personally don't use a whole lot of it just because I see it as this is more RNG, whereas something like healing is more of a sure thing. So ultimately it's going to be up to you and how you want to do your build. It is very useful to have certain effects not happen during fights because you resisted them, but it's going to depend on the content. It's going to depend on what you prioritize. But if you end up with no resistance whatsoever, it's not going to keep you out of any content. You can do just fine. Critical defense. This has changed in usefulness over the years. So for a while, mobs were not critting at all, and this basically was useless. And at a base, Warden gets, you get the shield tactics buff, you get a passive for just playing Warden, you have your shield which has a critical defense rating on it, and you can potentially get the 7 extra percent in blue if you want. Just this update, or around this time period, mobs have started doing a lot more crits again, so this has kind of gained a bit of usefulness again, but whatever you get on the class by default between those 4 buffs basically should be enough. You don't really need to put anything into this. Incoming healing rating, this is very useful. So you can get it to, at its base cap, 25%. And then if you play Race of Man, you get another 5% over cap, sending you at 30%. Then remember you have Persevere with 7.5% incoming healing on it, and you're going to have that up all the time. So now you're at 37.5%. Then you have to remember healers. So they typically have an incoming heal buff between 5 and 10%, most of them are. So let's say 10%. Now you're at 47.5% incoming healing. And then, if you have a set that increases incoming healing, you could potentially be over 50%. So this just keeps going up, and it's very useful. Block, parry, and evade. So another thing, this is what the Warden rework was done to move away from. For a very long time, mobs could not be block, parried, and evade, and this basically became worthless and was a big weakness for Warden. Now, this recent update and these new instances that have come out this update, a lot more enemies are BPE-able, so you may find a use for this. But I have not needed to stack any of these in my build at any point at all. Just with my gambit buffs and gear, I have blown these percentages away, basically. Warden gets inherent base extra parry, so you're automatically going to have that much higher, and you get very high block ratings from gambits. If you decide that you want to put more BPE in your build, that's fine. And basically, just the way I see it is, this is RNG, and it might help, but something like healing is a sure thing, and it will help. So I haven't invested a whole lot into it, and I've played for many, many years without focusing on this or messing with it at all, and I've not had an issue. So it's not like you can't tank without it. Just if you decide you want it in your build as an extra thing, go for it. Now, mitigations, this is not up for debate. This is just how this works. So this fourth column right here, where it says tier 3 down, this is what you're shooting for. Now, Warden is medium, so you want to shoot for this 155,000 right here. Now this number is going to change in the future. This whole page is going to change in the future. The percents are probably going to stay the same, but the rating numbers are going to change. So if you're in another update and this number is different, that's what you're shooting for. So that's T3 through T5. This is the mitigation you need to have to eliminate the bypass from mobs in those instances and raids. If you have below this, you are taking extra damage that you shouldn't be. And if it's way too low, you're just going to get one shot. So you can get away with this a little bit on Warden. So, for example, at the time of making this video, warding lore scrolls are about 4100 mitigation rating, and then you've got your gambit buffs, and they've got around 9,000 on them. And then with two of those, you can sit at like 141,000, and then with all those up, you'll be at 155,000. And then you don't have any overlap and wasted space, but you have to remember you have to keep all that up. Otherwise, you will be under this. But this is the number you want to be at to be safe. And then that is going to put you at overcapped 50% through T3 through T5. But that's not the end of it. Afterward, you need to get this higher, much higher, if you intend on seriously tanking in higher tier content. So you're going to be at 50 or 50% as a base, and then you are going to have, just for being in blue, you're going to get a 7% buff. So now you're at 57%. Now, once you go through your gambit buffs, you should be sitting, so you're going to have, you have two 5% buffs, and that's going to put you at 62%. And then you have two 3% buffs. That's going to put you at 65%. Then there's the 2 set from the legendary items, and you can get another 1.5% overcap. Now you're at 66.5. Then, at the time of making this video, Ethelharn rolls exist. They are giving 1% mitigation right now. That'll put you at 67.5%. Then you have to look at other buffs from other classes. So like, let's say you're in a raid and you have one minstrel healer and your second healer is a captain. So from the minstrel healer, you're going to be getting 3% mitigation. So now you're at 70.5%. Now you have a second healer, captain, right? Now captain has a herald that gives 2% mitigation right now. So now you're at 72.5% mitigation, and captain has the focus buff in blue. So now you're at 74.5% mitigation. See how this works? See how it just keeps going up? You're finding these little ways to add little bits more to it. This is what you're shooting for when you're trying to tank harder, higher tier content. You have to do this to some degree and get this number up. Otherwise, you're going to take too much damage, and you are just going to get one shot from harder bosses. These are not the only ways to get this up higher. Hypothetically, there are more ways to get it higher, as there's various raid sets over time that give 1 or 2% mitigation on them, and there's also things like, at different points there have been Warden class essences that have given more mitigation, and then you could use those too to get it even higher. So it just is as many ways as you can possibly find to push this number up. That is your main priority as a tank. Clarify so everyone understands, you need the proper mitigation for the proper boss fight. So if the boss does physical damage, you need physical mitigation. If the boss does tactical damage, you need tactical mitigation. There is no supplement for this. You need mitigation as a tank. So the best case scenario, if you do manage to complete something and you have under the mitigation you're supposed to have, your group's going to hate you and your healer's going to hate you. And worst case scenario is you get one shot and it's simply not possible. There is no alternative, there is no supplement to having mitigation as a tank. That is your first priority as a tank, pretty much in any MMO, is that you have this as high as you can possibly get it. And then once you have mitigation squared away, that's when you focus on anything else you can fit in your build. Now for DPS. So I haven't talked about traits and legendary items yet. I will do that in the next section at some point. But for stats for DPS, critical chance, this is much more important in DPS than it is in tank. So you're going to start with your base of 25%, and then you are going to, in the red line, you're going to have a 2.5% passive bonus to critical chance, so that's going to put you at 27.5%. And then you have, there's on legendary items, there's a 2-set you can get for a 3% chance. Now you're at 30.5% chance. Then in red line, there's a 10% damage over time critical chance. That is going to put you at 40.5% for damage over time. And on legendary items, there's a 5.5% critical chance for all damage types, but you can get one for damage over time as well. So then you're going to be at 46% critical chance. And then with group buffs, that can go potentially even higher, and you can be over 50% critical chance on your damage over time. And that is where the vast majority of your DPS on the high end is going to come from your crit and your critical and devastating hit magnitude. That is where the big DPS comes from. Now, you should get your damage up first, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but the damage is what makes your dots be bigger, but then where the DPS is going to come from is from having the crit stacked on top of the damage. Now, for finesse, this is a bit different than with tank. So typically for finesse, when I DPS, I typically would want to be over 27%. Once you have decent gear for whatever the new update is, I'd like to be over 27%. I have not had an issue with that. Basically, like I said before, I know some people stack over 35%. I haven't needed to do that. 27% or so works fine for me in DPS. And again, that is going to depend on you and what you want. And then now talking about damage. So 200% is the rating cap, and that is obviously what you want to get to. And as a DPS, this is probably the first thing you want to get up, because this is the easiest way to just increase your damage. Now, you are going to get 5% melee damage for being in red automatically, and then you have the two different traits, one red and one yellow, for 10% more melee damage at the start, or one for melee, one for ranged. So basically, depending on what you're going to play, if you're going to play melee or you're going to play an assailant, you pick one or the other, not both. So let's say you're melee, so you pick the melee one, now you're at 215%, right? And then when you start your rotation, you should always be starting it with Warden's Triumph, and if you have the proper traits in red, that'll be 12%. So then you're going to be at 227%, and then on your opening rotation, you're probably going to be using Recklessness as well. That's 20%, so now you're at 247%. See how this works? And then you have to also consider group buff, so you could potentially get this way, way, way higher. So that is what you want to be prioritizing in your DPS build. Mostly is you want to get your damage overcapped as much as possible and your crit overcapped as much as possible. And then all these stats through here, these don't really have a point on DPS in a group content setting. Your mitigations and your DPS build, this is going to depend on the content and what you can get away with. But for a harder content where there's a lot of force damage and you're going to be taking damage while you are doing DPS, you would want to shoot for hard capping what is for light, basically. So the content has to be balanced so that light armor classes don't get one shot. So as a minimum, you want to have around that. And then you don't need to worry about the rest of what you could potentially get as a medium armor class, because if the light armor classes can survive with that amount, then you don't need more than that amount. And that is going to open up a lot of space for you to focus on your damage and crit, rather than needing to stack more mitigation that may not be necessary. Let's talk about what Warden brings to the table. Why should you bring a Warden tank? So, first of all these debuffs and buffs on the screen here for one, and Warden is a very self-sufficient tank, so it kind of behaves very differently to the other tanks in the game, in that there are quite a lot of fights in the game. Like, it would take me a very long time to go through all the different fights that are possible to pull off without a healer, but that's another conversation for another time. So right here on the screen, mark target and diminish target up here on the left. Now, these two debuffs right here alone make having this class in the group worth it. I don't think a lot of people understand how potent these are. These have been nerfed multiple times over the years from higher numbers, and even now in its nerf state, they're still very potent. So if you're playing the class properly, you can keep these up permanently on everything. They have a 1 minute duration, and you can just keep reapplying it before then. This is a net gain to your group's DPS. A lot of enemies have extremely high mitigation now, and most people aren't using mitigation debuffs properly, and it's causing them to take insanely long amounts of time on fights or not complete them at all. So you need to be using mitigation buffs or debuffs right now. And also on the right here, battering strikes and suppression. You can keep these two up permanently as well if you know what you're doing. Battering strikes is a pretty potent critical defense debuff. This synergizes very well with other class critical defense debuffs, especially like burglar, because burglars is a percent debuff and this is a rating debuff. So with a rating debuff, you can lower it down to a point where if you manage to zero out a mob's critical defense, then using percent debuffs, you can go below 0. Now, with suppression, this at tier 3 is minus 5% outgoing damage. This on its own is not very powerful, but when combined with other debuffs, like with Burglar or Lore Master, for example, it does help out a lot. Now, over here on the left, the Broken Armor, Shattered Spear, this is the Desperate Spear debuff. So, as I showed in an earlier section, you can potentially keep this up for 40 seconds. And if you have, at the current time of making this video, the current raid set, you can get this debuff to 10% for 40 seconds. So that, along with these other debuffs up here, and here in the middle, Fire at Will. So this is resettable with Snapshot. So you could potentially set this off multiple times, and you control when it goes off. So you can do it right as you start an Oathbreaker or something like that. So you have all of these you're bringing to the group, and it is a massive increase in the amount of damage being done. And if you have, for example, a fight and you and the Guardian are both going to use your debuffs and your buffs at the same time, and the Guardian's also going to do break ranks, all of this is extremely potent if done during an Oathbreaker burn, and this is essentially how the devs intend you to meet damage checks in group content. Now, these three buffs right here for the Free Peoples, Conviction, and Fellowship Protector. So, for the Free Peoples is your group protect. This is where other tanks tend to shine more than Warden, is they have better group protects than Warden does. Warden's is only 20% at best for the group. Other tanks tend to be around more 50%. So Warden is much more increasing damage focused rather than protecting the group focused. Good way to think of it is Warden kind of helps itself to help the group more, whereas other tanks are more helping the group directly focused. Conviction, this can be hypothetically kept up 100% of the time if you're able to do it. It is very costly in power and time consuming, but if you have the opportunity, you can do it. That is very helpful to keeping the group sustained. And Fellowship Protector here, every time you spend 3 stacks of Advanced Technique, you're going to give the group minus 5% incoming damage, so just a little extra boost there. Now, other than that, as I said, Warden is a very self-sufficient tank. There are things you can do with it you can't do on any other class, and a lot of this is like, for example, if the healer dies, Warden is in the best position to keep going without a healer than other tanks are. Another thing Warden can do that is very hard for other tanks is removing something from the fight, like a mini boss, for example, and just taking it somewhere else, like behind a corner or something, so it's not a problem anymore, and just removing it from the fight. A good real world example of this is back at 105, the instance Silent Street. The way the boss worked there was you had the main boss and then mini bosses spawned over time. something Warden was very unique in being able to do is take the main boss completely out of the area and in a corner somewhere and tank it by yourself, and the other 5 people in the group could go deal with the rest of the instance. And it was a much easier and much more manageable way to deal with the fight than was probably intended by the developers. So there's a lot of advantages to having a tank that can go off and do their own thing without a healer in some situations. Another thing that I'd like to mention that a lot of people don't know even exists is Warden is the only class that can really truly play hybrid. So you can, for example, be in blue, but then have red gear on, and it's going to depend specifically on the type of content, but it is possible for you to be an off tank and strong enough to survive fighting a boss, and then when a point in the fight comes in which you are no longer needed as an off tank, you can immediately go into playing as a DPS, and you're not going to do anywhere near the same amount of DPS that you would be if you were actually in red, but you are still putting out a comparable amount of damage that is better than nothing, while still being able to maintain everything you see here on the screen right now. So I have done this in fights before, where basically a boss will start out and there will be several mini bosses, and if there's like a tank swap debuffs where you have to keep swapping bosses with other tanks, you do that for a while, but then once there's one boss, there's not as much of a need for you to be an off tank at that point, and then you kind of find yourself just standing around. And if you're built in a bit of a hybrid way, you could just at that point start behaving like a DPS basically, and you still have access to all your dots and most of your buffs and everything, so it's very possible to do a decent amount of damage while tanking as Warden, but it requires a lot of knowledge about the class, and it requires a lot of very specific building. It's not something I would want to make a video about, just because it's very complicated, and it is entirely case by case in the instance to optimize doing. It's not something you can just carry around all the time and expect it to work, but it is a thing, it does exist, and it's something unique specifically to Warden. Now, in DPS, this is more what it's going to look like. So you're not going to have the group protect, and you're not going to have the Desperate Spear debuff, but you are going to have, of course, all the DPS that you can muster from the class, and you're going to have access to these debuffs. Now, marked and diminished target is going to work basically the same. Fire at will, this will proc more often with Snapshot in red. I don't know why it does that, it just does. I find when I play in red that Snapshot will reset Javelin skills much more often. Battering strikes, now this is going to depend. You can play red without it, but the reason that it's a problem is because it's very hard to find a place to fit this debuff into your rotation, because as you'll see later when I do the DPS section, you want to get all your dots on the target and you need to keep DPS moving, but it's very out of the way to get to the battering strikes debuff. So if you stop at the beginning to put it on the target, you're not putting out DPS. And if you save it to the end of the rotation, that works, but then you're kind of skimping on other DPS you could be doing somewhere else, but I'll talk about more of that later. And suppression, that will have no issue staying on the target at all times because you're going to be doing AoE fist dots often. And then conviction will last less time in red, but it is still very usable in red. It's still very helpful, especially when you're moving around in a forced damage section and damage is no longer possible and you're just trying to keep people alive. It helps out a lot. Move on to the DPS section. I'm going to go over some useful tricks and unique niche things to Warden. Some of these vary from extremely useful and broken to basically worthless outside of a couple select situations, but these are very useful things to know if you're going to be playing Warden. Regardless of whether you're playing tank or DPS, these can be very helpful in various situations. The first thing is, a lot of people don't either know or forget that this exists, but when you have the battle memory up for Warden, if you go into Assailment and use ranged boot and then go back into melee, you can keep the ranged boot in your battle memory, and this effectively functions as a range interrupt. So you can be tanking a fight that may be very dynamic and you have to move around a lot, and if the boss is going to be away from you at some point and you suddenly need to interrupt and there's no one else that can do it, you have access to a ranged interrupt that you could potentially keep using over and over again if you need to. And this is something that makes Warden very different from most tanks. Next is Warden has access to a spam single target interrupt. So you have the boot and you have shield slam that are both interrupts. Now, typically, if you're in a group that is set up well, you can interrupt with no problem, and if everyone knows what they're doing, you should have no problem meeting all the interrupts. Every class has some kind of interrupt pretty much, but this way you have the ability to, either if you're on your own or everyone's interrupts on cooldown or whatever the problem is, you have the ability to interrupt numerous times over and over again, potentially endlessly if you cycle it properly. So it's a very useful thing. Over time, there have been some fights and some instance clusters where spam interrupting has been useful, and hypothetically, you could meet every single interrupt even if you're not intended to by the developers, so it is very useful. Now, for the in-combat sprint, I mentioned earlier, I said I would show how this works. So basically, when you have this trait in yellow, and then you use this gambit, for the rest of the time that you are in combat, you will have instant ambush. Now, because of the way it's had to be coded, it's still considered an induction skill. The induction is just 0, basically. But if you see, while I'm running around, you can't get it to go off. So you have to stop for a second, and then it'll go off. And then you have your in-combat sprint. And if you need more time on it, because this is only 5 seconds, if you need more time on it, you can chain it with one of these combat run speed boosts afterward. And these drop pretty frequently out of Hobbit presence, so it's not hard to have a decent number of these on hand. Warden, generally speaking, has a pretty terrible corruption removal just because of how clunky it is, and it can be hard to get to in the middle of a fight. But if you prepare for it, you can get many corruption removals off at once, not just through battle memory, but also thanks to rapid techniques. You can potentially spam reversal for the corruption removal over and over again. And this is very useful for fights where you have to remove many corruptions very fast, as this will make some fights extremely easy. Like, say if a boss gets, I don't know, 10 corruptions and you need to remove them all very fast, or something happens, then this is much easier than other combinations of classes that have to wait for their cooldowns on their corruption removal. Another thing is playing an assailment and range tanking. So this has not been a super important thing for a very long time. Back in the day, it was kind of, for a while, there were some fights where there was a niche use for Warden range tanking. So immediately what comes to mind is the second boss of Barad Golder, the caster boss. She would knock you away if you were too close, so it was very useful to have a tank that could sit back and have access to most of your skills at range. And there are other fights throughout the game where this is useful. The first boss on Lost Temple has a mechanic where the twins need to be separated, basically. And there are a lot of fights throughout the game with twin-type archetype bosses that need to be separated. And while any tank can do that, it's very nice having access to your core skills as a tank, whereas those tanks typically need to be in melee range of a target. Majority of the Warden class can be played at range. So, and more recently, a fight where this has come in useful is T3 through T5 of Sarch Forn. So the boss above T3 on that has an ability called Judgment, which is a vortex and pulls everyone in. And normally that would mean for a melee tank that you would have to run back and forth on a timer whenever that ability is about to be played. So on Warden, it is possible for you to just stand back from the boss the entire fight, and then you don't have to be anywhere near it at any point. And along with the ranged interrupt that I showed earlier, you can still interrupt the boss at range, and you never have to get close to it. You never have to go up close and risk not moving away before that ability goes off and potentially causing a wipe. I showed battle memory multiple times throughout this video, but just to show it again, basically, you can store any gambit to be used later, and it costs morale to use, but these days it's not a too substantial amount of morale, but it does come in very useful often, whether it's for corruption removals or a heal like conviction, for example. But also you can use it to keep things there in an emergency that you might need later. So I know that some people keep restoration here, and they use this as a quick way to get it back when they need it. And another thing you could do if you're keeping it as an emergency heals is you can use Celebration of Skill and keep this here as its burst heal, and then you'll always have a burst heal right here ready to go. Another thing most people forget about is Warden has access to stealth. Now, you're not going to have a whole lot of use for stealth on the class outside of PvP. In PvP, it's mostly just for actually ambushing people and for dumping tracks. But in PvE, there are some uses for it. In group content, it's mostly for doing things that aren't intended, basically. You can skip some pulls that you're not supposed to, or you can control what mobs you're pulling so you don't trigger a chain pull by going around a pull that's supposed to be next. So there are some creative things you can do with it, but other than that, it has limited usefulness. Alright. Time for DPS. Doesn't this page look fun? Well, it's actually not that hard, so if this is the first time that you're seeing this, don't be intimidated by it. It's not as hard as it looks, and once you get the hang of it, it is not hard to get this off within 44 seconds. So I say 44 seconds at the moment. Single Warden rotation is about 44 seconds because that is the duration of the first dot you should be putting on the target, which is Unerring Strike. Now, your rotation is, it should start with Warden's Triumph because you're going to want the damage and the dot pulses, and you ideally want to keep this up at all times when you're doing rotations. So I'll show what this actually looks like on a training dummy after this at some point, but just to talk about how this works here. So your goal is to, in your first rotation you're opening, so let's say on like a raid boss, for example, you're probably going to be putting Javelin of Deadly Force on first, put your debuffs on quickly, and you're going to be using Recklessness and Fire at Will, which I don't have on the screen right now, and you're going to start your rotation with Warden's Triumph, and you're going to start going through, and then once you hit a wall, you're going to hit Rapid Techniques, and you're going to use that to basically spam out the rest of your rotation. Now, there's two main ways people are doing this right now. So you can go left to right, top to bottom, how I have them listed here, these dots. So you can start with the longest durations and just go down the list until you end with the shortest duration. And doing it that way will build one massive big wave. And then finally at the end of the rotation, when you cash out with Cauterizing Steel on the last dot tick of Unerring, there will be a huge burst. And the other way you can do this is some people are running their single target fist dots here. They will weave these in closer to the start of the rotation for more immediate damage. But then at the end of your rotation, your timetable is a lot tighter, and you have less time to line up your one last big burst. So ultimately, it's going to depend on the situation. The way I like to do it, because for the last several years, the way a lot of raid bosses have worked is that basically you do so much damage to them, however much percent of their health, and then they will suddenly green bar or phase, and then there will be either a mechanic you have to go do, some kind of force damage phase where you all have to run around and you can't damage the boss during that, or it'll spawn a wave of ads, something, whatever. So you typically in those situations wouldn't have a huge opportunity to just keep attacking over and over again, so you're probably only get one or two rotations off in that scenario. That's why I like to do the one big wave thing where you get all your dots on the target, and then you have some time at the end of the rotation to do what you need to do, and then you do your one big burst. But if you have a fight that's more prolonged over time and you need to do more damage front-loaded at the beginning, you may want to put some of these single target spear dots in closer to the start of the rotation, because these tick faster, especially Spear of Fate here, it ticks every 1 second. That's one thing people miss, is the reason this gambit is the way it is because it ticks every 1 second. So you could hypothetically fit this in multiple places and keep having it going while everything else is going. It depends on the situation, and if you really want your maximum burst out of this, you're going to want to do it during a Captain's Oathbreaker, or whenever you are doing your DPS check burn phase, basically, when everyone else is going to burn their cooldowns and on everything. So if you do this as one big wave, as I said, and you just run down the line of duration and then end, if you did it right and you were fast enough, you're going to have somewhere in the realm of 12 to 20 seconds of free time at the end of the rotation. And this can be done, this can give you a chance to go do mechanics, or if there's force damage you need to get away from. If it's a dynamic fight and you can't just sit in one place and parse, which is majority of fights, this helps out a lot. But so if you are running battering strikes in DPS, this is a good chance to apply it with the offensive strike line. And you can also fit in a couple walls of steel at the end of the rotation too, if you have free time, and this will add some more burst because you have all your dots on the target already, and then you can fit a couple more of these in for more damage. Just whatever you do, make sure that by the last 4 seconds of unerring strike, you get Cauterizing Steel off, because if you miss this, you're missing out on a lot of damage. Cauterizing Steel, at the time of making this video, is probably one of the highest hitting skills in the game. It's on that top list. So before the stat changes, I was able to get multi-million damage hits with this, and now after the stat changes, after everything's been brought down in numbers, you can still get multi-100,000 hits with this skill. So if you are not using this, if you're not properly cashing this out on the last tick of this, you are losing a lot of DPS potential. Now, there's two kinds of rotations that you're going to be doing mainly. So your opening rotation is probably going to start with all your buffs and Javelin of Deadly Force for your debuffs, and you're going to probably use Recklessness and Rapid Techniques on your opening. Your next rotation, assuming that there was no green bar or phase on the boss after that, and you're doing another rotation, that rotation is going to be slower, and it's going to be less efficient because these two are going to be on cooldown. So that one is mainly going to be fitting in whatever you can and maintaining what you can until you have time to get these off cooldown, and then you'll restart the same way you do your opening. Now, I have linked here also Deflection, just because it would be remiss of me not to show this while showing basically how Warden DPS works and how you can put out insane damage in aggro to not show the aggro dump here, basically. So this is similar to Hunters Beneath Notice, basically. So most DPS classes have some way to drop aggro, and 99.99999% of people do not use them, and it often can cause aggro problems at the start of the fight. Now, you probably will never need to use this. This is not that important. It's just this has a time and place. So, like, if ads are coming in and you have a limited amount of time and you want to start DPS on them immediately and the tank hasn't taken them and doesn't fully have them yet, if you use this first and then start putting dots on it, you're not going to generate so much aggro that they're going to come and kill you. So just be aware that this exists and it has uses. Now, in the next section, I'm going to show what this actually looks like on the training dummy, but for right now, this screen has most of what you're going to be fitting in a rotation, pretty much. If you're in Assailment, now, I see a lot of Wardens out there, just in the wild, basically, playing randomly, that are exclusively always in Assailment. And they are basically just trying to be a DPS. And you understand that when you're playing an assailment, you're not getting desolation, you're not getting surety of death, you're not getting brink of victory. You can get resounding challenge, but it's much jankier in assailment, and you are not getting war cry because you are standing at range and you are out of range to apply these AoEs. Now, if you're standing in melee range to apply these AoEs, why aren't you in melee? That's the point. So, basically, unless there's a specific reason for you to be an assailment, so let's say you've got a boss fight and there's a lot of force damage and there's a lot of 360 AoE and it's just easier for you to be at range. Or let's say the boss specifically takes more range damage. Or let's say you can't even get to the boss in the first place and it's just a ranged fight. Then in that case, yes, assailment makes sense. But otherwise, generally speaking, Warden is a primarily melee class, and you are just going to be hurting yourself by playing an assailment and missing out on all these dots. And you're going to have a much easier time applying all of this quickly in melee because the animations are much faster as well. I also need to mention you need to be careful with resounding challenge in a raid setting, or just in group content in general, because remember that this skill has a 20-meter range, and if you have mobs off to the sides that are CC'd, it is extremely easy to break them out with this. This is something that I've seen a lot of people doing, is they either don't know how to apply this in such a way that breaks things out. So like if you want to apply this, have this on the boss when there's CC'd mobs nearby and you don't want to break them out, you kind of need to move away so that only the boss is within range of it. It's a bit tricky to do, or you can use line of sight as well. Or they are just simply not using this dot, and that is a DPS loss. So you just need to be careful with it and be aware that it is going to basically hit the entire area. So you need to be cognizant of what is around you when you're using this. Now for DPS traits. So first of all, you want basically these 4 starting traits right here you're going to want. So depending on whether you're going to be melee or ranged, if you are going to be playing an assailment, instead of taking this one, you're going to want to take this one right here. And basically, whichever one you take, this is going to overcap you. So if you had 200%, this is going to put you at 210%. Vital points, this is just more bleed damage. Of course, you're going to want that. You're going to want this. At the moment, Unerring Strike, Mighty Blow, and Power Attack are pretty much your more powerful dots. Unerring Strike is pretty much your most powerful dot. So you are going to want to invest as much into them as you can. This is just more damage. Light damage, you're always going to want. This specifically just affects initial damage of spear gamuts. You're probably going to want this, as this is just going to add to the DPS other than the dots. And this right here, a lot of people don't understand how this works, so this is going to give you more dot critical chance. This is not connected to your critical chance, so you're not going to see this, but this is going on in the background. So when I go into the Warden legendary items, you're going to see that basically you can have as high as you can get your crit. So like say if you have 30.5% crit chance, you add this on top, then you've got 40.5% dot crit chance. So you can get insanely high dot crit chance on Warden. And here, deep wounds, any way you can get critical damage, you should do, because that's going to basically be how you're doing DPS. And lasting impression, this is just for more dot pulses, and if your spear bleeds do expire, they do a lot of damage, but like I said, you should be cashing them out with cauterizing for the most damage. And this is to make Warden's Triumph last longer and have the most damage bonus on it. And then of course you're going to want Recklessness. And over in yellow, Bane of Shadow, 20% light damage, yes, you're going to want this. And as the same with before in tanking I mentioned with marked and diminished, you can skimp some points out of these. You're going to be reapplying them early, so you don't need the full 60 seconds duration. And bullseye, you're going to want the critical chance, and if you're going to be playing in assailment, you're going to want the ranged critical damage on the 6th rank. And then finesse, depending on what your build will need. Strong foundations, again, always want this, always. And I just want to mention while we're here, battering strikes is specifically in this build that I'm using right now. I'm not using this just because I don't have a lot of time to keep it up in the DPS rotation, but you very well may want this in your group comp. This, like as I said, it's a very potent critical defense debuff. So if it's for you and you are going to be putting it into a raid setting, you're probably going to want this. And I'm probably in the future going to change this up and put points into this and be using it in DPS again as well. It's just at the moment I don't have this on. And suppression, you're always going to have this up at all times basically. Javelin of Deadly Force, the same with tanking, is you are going to want to always have your marked and diminished up, and this is the easiest way to do it. And in DPS, this is also a pretty decent burst. So this is very good for kind of cleaving a trash pool. And also want to mention, there's the range damage and critical damage buff on this. So however many targets you hit, you get a range damage and critical damage buff. That's useful if you're going to be playing an assailment. Snapshot, this is much more useful in red. For whatever reason, it goes off much more often in DPS than it does in tank. I have no idea why, it just does. And fire at will, again, with snapshot, this is going to reset a lot more often. It's very useful, and you're probably going to use this during Oathbreaker burns, and then rapid techniques. Every warden should have this. And over here in blue, I have the 5 for the Warcry Fist Gambit damage. You don't really need that, and I have a Force Taunt. Now, why do I have a Force Taunt in DPS? I've been asked this a lot. So, depending on the content, it may be advantageous for a DPS to have a Force Taunt. Over the years, there have been a lot of scenarios where, for a small period of time, a DPS needs to basically function as an off tank and control an enemy because it doesn't make sense to have a second tank. So that often comes into play in 6-mans. And there are other times when it may just be advantageous for a DPS to be able to bring a trash pull to the tank instead of the tank having to reposition entirely. And you can also use this to save a wipe from happening. If somebody dies, like tank, you can potentially hit this and then kite for a second until they're back up, and then they can take the mobs back off of you. This has a lot of niche uses, and there are some pieces of content where someone else other than the tank in the group needs to do something with a Force Taunt. So it is just useful to have, and I've typically had it over the years. You do not need this. It's not crucial to the build. You don't need it to DPS, and if you are hurting for points, you don't have to invest in this, and there's no reason to have it if you don't know how to use it, essentially. And the passives, so sharpened spears, just extra initial damage. Unconventional strikes, this is just more initial damage, basically. And this is one of the overcaps to crit. This will give you 2.5% overcap critical chance. So if you don't have any of the other boosts, your base, this will basically put you at 27.5% critical chance. And this was changed with the rework. So what this used to be basically was you would parry an attack and things would cost nothing, so masteries would cost nothing and you would get a small heal. That is gone now. Now, if you BPE, you will basically proc off a little damage hit. This is basically worthless just because you're not supposed to be BPEing. That's not a good thing. So one after another, this is basically just going to heal you after things die. This is going to help you sustain when there's a lot of AoE cleave going on and more initial damage. And Grandmaster Weapons Training, this is also going to overcap your DPS by 5%. So if you're at 200%, this will be 205%. And this basically was changed at some point in the last year so that spears are faster now. The animations are much faster, and the dot is more useful now on them. And there was what I suspect to be a bug associated with the spears that I will mention later. But at the moment, I'm using a spear as a DPS weapon because I want the extra dot, and the faster attacks are substantial. Spear is now substantially faster than the other weapons, so I chose to use that. And this also affects the attack speed debuff from clubs, and you will get more parry from swords than you already getting, because remember, Wardens also have a passive increase to parry as well. And then Martial Fury, this is for just your more damage over time pulses and more damage, basically. Now, why I didn't pick certain things here, it's basically this is leftover from back when Offensive Strike used to have a morale tap on it. That has since been removed, and this doesn't really serve a purpose in red. It doesn't even really serve a purpose in blue, so there's no reason to take this. This is the incoming heal Warden has now, incoming heal debuff, and the reason I left this out of what Warden brings to the table is because it's very niche. It is the nichest of niche. It has extremely little use. Like, there are uses over the years for it, but you're probably not going to use it, and there's just no purpose to waste points on it. It's not even good in PvP, so don't bother. And this was added some years ago to help with power issues. At the moment, Warden does have a lot of power consumption, but it also has a lot of power restoration, so I don't feel that I need this. But if you want more potent power restores and you're doing double casts on Dark Before Dawn through battle memory, you may want this, but you don't need it. And over here, you don't need movement training. This doesn't really serve a purpose in red. This you can take to increase the duration of debuffs, but you're going to be putting them out so fast, specifically suppression, that they're never going to go down pretty much. And again, I explained how these two work. And then if you're going to be playing primarily in Assailment, then you may want this. This is going to make your life easier. And this is basically for niche use if you're going to be really, really far away. And then this, if you're also going to be playing primarily in Assailment, this may have some more use for you as well. And this depends if you want it. You're probably not going to need this very much in red, but you may need this at some point if you want it. Now for Warden legendary items here, I have 2 heraldries of the Keen Serpent, and for those that are unaware, that is part of the Heroic Precision set. So 2-piece set, you get a 3% overcap on crit, and with the 4-piece set, you just get more crit. And I have damage over time. Obviously, you're going to want this on Warden. Damage over time criticals, again, obviously you're going to want it. Fist Gambit damage and critical chance, again, so you can see how many ways there are for you to push your critical chance up. Fist Shield damage over time, this is for your Desolation line, basically. Recklessness duration, you're going to want that, as that is going to help you fit everything into your rotation underneath Recklessness. Mastery cooldowns, every Warden build should have this. Fist Spear Gambit damage, that is for your Precise Strike line. Shield Gambit line healing. Now, this is not for DPS. The reason I have this on here is because I had openings, and basically, you're going to have situations a lot where you're dying and you need to take care of yourself, and the healer's busy, and if you don't have this, your healing is pretty abysmal in red. So I feel that any Warden, regardless of what your build, should have Shield Gambit line healing slotted, just because at some point you're going to use it. Ascendant Light, the 2 set from these is going to give you 15% light damage. And single target attack criticals, again, this is for most of your dots are single target, so it's just a better chance for them to crit. Single target attack damage, this is just because your most important parses are going to be on a single target, so you're going to want the single target attack initial damage to be higher. And then I have area of effect attack criticals. This is going to help with AoE cleave on trash pulls and adds. Spear Gambit initial damage. This is again just to add to damage going on other than dots. So this is just your initial damage from anything involving spear. Spear Shield Gambit damage. This is anything in that sequence, so Wall of Steel, etc. Javelin of Deadly Force damage, I have this on because, as I said earlier, Javelin Deadly Force is a pretty decent AoE cleave as well. Way of the Spear bonuses, you don't really need this. If you want to not have this and put something else there, that's fine. The reason I have this is because I had nothing better to put there, and because that Way of Spear, Shield, and Fist is pretty much your only cash out for Advanced Technique in red. And even with this bonus, it's not that great. So it's just something to spend and use, basically. Marked and Diminished Potency. Again, every Warden build should have this. And here I have Heal bonus for Conviction. Again, just like with Shield Gambit line healing, I end up using Conviction quite a lot in DPS to help with group sustain. And it helps a lot to just push that number up without interfering with DPS. So the reason I have non-DPS related things slotted here is because I just did not see a need to slot anything else. And I basically had open slots, and I was like, well, what do I put here? And I just picked what made the most sense. And then the 2 Heroic Precisions at the bottom here, this is for part of the 4 set with the 2 Heraldries. Alright, I was going to record this where I used to have my house, but apparently the place where I used to have my house that used to have a nice waterfall behind it, the developers removed the waterfall, and now there's just a hole. So I had to find a new place to record this. So first I'm going to show the single wave method I talked about, and I'm just going to put everything on the target, and then we'll talk about it. Now, as you can see, that's all the dots on the target, and basically, whatever you have left on your unerring strike dot is what you have left in the rotation, and then once you get below 4 seconds on it, that's when you do your cauterizing steel cash out, and then the rotation repeats. So, basically, within those last 12 to 20 seconds, depending on how fast it went, you will have that entire time is spent doing whatever you need to do. So if you do it this way, basically you can go focus on ads, you can go do mechanics, whatever that is, you can move away from the boss if you're dying from force damage. If you have battering strikes and you want to apply it, you can use offensive strike line, and you can do multiple walls of steel in that time with battle memory, and those crit very high, so that adds a lot of burst to the end of the rotation, and then you finish off with your final cauterizing steel cash out, and then it repeats. So that's one way to do it, and again, that tends to be useful when the boss is going to green bar very early into the fight, and you've only got really enough time for 1 or 2 rotations. So that's a good way to keep everything on the target and then be able to multitask toward the end of it. And I'm going to show the other way here in a second. Now the other way is the front-loaded method, and this way you're going to have more damage toward the start of the rotation, and I'll show that here. Now this way, you're going to have more damage faster, and you are going to finish around the same time to have unerring strike be ticking down from around 12 seconds again, but this way you're going to see those single target fist dots have already left the target. So if you want to make your cash out and keep damage going out, you have a lot more things to keep up in that time period. You have less time to do multiple walls of steel, and you basically have no time to leave the target if you want to keep this all up. So if it's a prolonged fight and you're basically doing a stationary parse where you're just going to stand around and DPS the boss for several minutes, this way is probably better because you're going to get more target damage on the target faster. But if it's a dynamic fight where you're going to have to stop, start over and over again throughout the fight, the single wave method tends to be better. Now, if it's a boss that is like an AoE boss, AoE focus boss, so like there's multiple bosses. There's some bosses in the game that start with like 4 mini bosses, and that's the entire fight basically. If there's many targets, you're starting at once. It could be a boss or a trash pull, whatever, and you're gonna want to start with AoE first. So basically, it'll look more like this. So that way you'd have damage going out on all targets at once, and then whichever the most important target is that you're taking down first, so whatever the raid assist target would probably be, that's when you'd focus the rest of the single target dots on. And it's kind of like inverting it upside down, so the AoE dots come first, and that's going to focus you in the cycle toward doing AoE in addition to whatever mob you're focusing down. And that's also probably how you're going to start more important trash pulls and ad waves, just because getting damage to go out and everything all at once is more important than you burning down one target at a time. I want to mention on that point as well, in regards to doing the AoE focus rotation, it's going to depend mostly on the pool, typically. So if you are, in that specific case, playing AoE focused, sort of like how a champion would. If you took a yellow champion, you'd want them for AoE. That's why you'd have them. So if your goal is to do AoE in a situation, then you're more worried about cleaving down the group as a whole than one particular mob. If there is one particular mob that is more important than out of all of them, then obviously you should focus that one first. So to give an example of that, something that buffs other enemies, kind of like a captain archetype mob, or something that triggers reflect on all the other enemies. I also want to mention about reflects. Some enemies have a reflectability, and you really need to watch that on Warden. It's bad enough as it is with other classes, and you see hunters one-shot themselves on it, but with Warden, it's especially bad if you aren't paying attention. So remember that your dots are extremely long duration, and majority of reflects reflect dots as well. So if you just loaded every target in front of you with a bunch of dots and then a reflect goes off and you weren't ready for it, there's a very good chance you're getting one shot within the next couple seconds. So that is always something you have to be aware of in whatever content you're doing. If there are reflects, you need to be watching out for. I want to talk about Warden and Red, basically how you're going to expect it to handle. So it's a bit different from other DPS at the time of making this recording. So since the Warden rework, for the most part, Warden DPS has stayed mostly the same. It just got longer and more complicated. But the survivability of Red has nosedived a lot. So you need to understand, if you're playing Red Warden, it can be a bit confusing because you're a dedicated shield class and you look tanky, and you typically are going to have more health and more mitigation than other DPS. But I can tell you that compared to other DPS, Warden is a lot squishier. He capped out at 50% mitigation at best in DPS, and if you're in higher tier content and you did what I said earlier and you've only done light overcap mitigation, then you're going to only have the same mitigation that a light armor would have. So you've got Never Surrender still, but it does have a 5-minute cooldown in Red, so you're probably only going to get to it once within a fight. But this alone does put you in front of other DPS, because this is basically a second chance if something goes really wrong. If you're caught in an AoE, or if the game lags, or if you need to save yourself if there was a last second reflect or something like that, this is basically a way for you to not die and get removed from the fight entirely because of bad luck. So that, and you still have access to pretty much all your gambits and your heals, and the healing is still decent in red, but your durations are extremely short. But it is possible to keep yourself alive with heals in red, and there are times when the healer is either going to be busy or doing something they shouldn't be doing, and you need heals, and you're just going to have to look after yourself. And this is a problem I see with a lot of Warden DPSs. The vast majority of Wardens out there are just solely focused on their DPS, and they don't seem to realize that they have healing, and it doesn't matter how much DPS you're doing, if you don't intervene and heal yourself, you're going to get removed from the fight, and then it doesn't matter how much DPS you were doing because you're dead. So if you need to, in the middle of a fight, use your healing. I see so many Wardens bleed out because the healer was busy, or the healer was dead, or something happened, and the people I see playing Warden do this, they will have like a dot on them, or they'll be getting hit by AoE, and they'll just continually let themselves bleed out slowly over time, and it could have easily been avoided with them just doing a quick restoration or something. And most of them don't even use Never Surrender. So don't be those people, and understand you have a full toolkit here, and it's very versatile, and you can be very creative with it. You don't have to be in parse mode 24/7 in a real boss fight. You can be adaptable, and you can do whatever you need to survive and finish the fight. Now, I also want to mention about picking your weapon. I might have mentioned earlier somewhere in the video that there was a problem with spears, and I'm going to talk about that here in a second, but I use a spear for DPS now. I used to use a sword, but they somewhat recently changed the way spears work, and now the dot's better, and the animation is much, much faster, and they improved some of the passives with it. So basically, you'll hear people talk a lot about what weapon should they use with the racial and everything. It helps, but it doesn't matter a whole lot. And for example, Race of Man gets the 5% sword bonus damage. So, but if you see here, with the 5% sword damage bonus, you have the Warden gets several passives that most people seem to have forgotten existed, because some of these are really old, like really, really old. But Master Sword training there on the right, with the two of those together, technically 7% damage, and then you get the extra parry, and I'll mention that in a second. But then if you look at Spear, you're getting 7% from Spears as well. So you're not losing damage from not using your racial with using a spear instead. And the dot isn't super huge, it's not a huge big deal, but it is going off constantly throughout the fight. It does help, it is nice. But what ultimately makes it, if you ask me, why you should use spear for DPS, is because it's so much faster. Like I don't think I can get to pick up on the footage how much faster it is than all the other weapons, but whatever they did with the animations with spear, it is so much faster. It is so easy to just run through your DPS chain with it now. Now, the problem with spear that I found is that, and I don't know if this is a bug, but it's just something I noticed with it. I figured, since, okay, so it's so much faster now, I should just use this in general. And I was going to make a tanking spear. And I thought that was going to make doing tanking stuff much faster. What I found was, when I used the tanking spear, for whatever reason, I took exponentially more damage. It was almost like, in addition to me attacking faster, it was like almost like the mobs attacked faster too. And I have a couple hunches as to why that problem might have arose, but I'm not certain of them, so I'm just going to keep it to myself. But It's just something to be aware of, that for whatever reason, it seems like tanking with a spear is really bad and you take a lot of damage. And so if you're going to choose a weapon for tanking, I really suggest it be sword. I don't see a reason not to use sword. Sword is all around just the best weapon for that. And between all the different passives you can get, you're going to get way more parry. And for DPS, just from the extra speed alone, I find spear is better. But if you're thinking about doing a hybrid build where you want to be primarily tank and then have the ability to do DPS, you might consider doing sword in that case as well. But as far as the racials go, and with each race having its own specific damage bonus for each weapon type, it's not that big a deal. It's not something you need to work into to do good DPS. It's just a little bonus that helps out a little bit. It's not the end of the world if you decide to go against what is optimal. I'm going to have instance footage in the next section, but before we do that, I want to talk for a second about lag. So, everyone never stops talking about it, at least on Evernight. It is constantly in world chat, and if you play this game, you probably have seen it, but this is my connection right here, and typically it's sitting around 29.5 lately, and loss is always 0%, but if your reason for not playing Warden is your ping, I'm here to tell you that that is not what is causing the lag. Your ping and your connection has nothing to do with it. The lag is server side. And whatever you want to say it is, whatever reason you can come up with, it doesn't matter, because I can tell you that even with my pristine connection, the lag is just as bad for me. Trust me. I'm getting all the same lag you are. I'm not on some special connection that is making me exempt from the lag. You're going to see in the footage that there's going to be numerous times where I try to launch a gambit and it just isn't going to happen. So I have learned to play around the lag, and there are some ways to mitigate the problem the lag causes. But other than that, your ping is not a deciding factor in whether you can play this class. It is just as bad as it is for everyone else. Something that might help you with lag. I'm not promising this will help you with lag, but it may help you with lag. This is something I use regularly to play with the lag, and basically, in order to use this to your advantage, you have to understand how the skill queue works. So, basically, you can queue about 2 or 3 skills, and if you watch, and I'll play multiple skills here real quick, real fast, and you'll see how they kind of buffer behind about 2 or 3, like 2 or 3 skills there. That exists to make the game feel good. So, if you're playing things really fast, that queue is there to pick up things that you are pressing too fast for the game to play, and it's going to play them in order that you played them, so that it feels like the game is keeping up with you. Now, that is a good thing. That is working as intended. That is what makes Lotro feel good, as opposed to other MMOs that use something like a universal cooldown. Now, the problem is when it lags, this is not working as intended. And I can show this here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just wait a second for my Javelin of Deadly Force and Fire at Will to come off cooldown. So as these come off cooldown here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull my Ethernet cable, and by pulling the Ethernet cable, I am simulating lag. So as you can see, multiple skills are trying to go off and they can't. Now, the last thing in that queue that I hit was Defiant Challenge. So when I plug this back in, it's like the lag spike stopping, and then Defiant Challenge is what's going to play. And that is the problem with lag, is it's not keeping up anymore with you, what you've put into the queue. So the way you can use this to your advantage is, let's say that you wanted to build Conviction, and there was a lag spike and all that happened was this. And basically what you're left with, and I'll pull my Ethernet cable here. So it looks like this, and that's what you got. And you tried to play Conviction, and it didn't happen, and it's all wrong, and it lagged out, and you don't want that. So what you're going to do is, I'm going to hit my 0 key, which is recovery, to remove all this. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm going to plug it back in, and it's going to clear that. Now, by doing that, I told the queue, by giving too many inputs, to drop everything beforehand. And this allowed me to clear something that was otherwise going to go off and take up time and waste resources, basically. And in doing this, you have some degree of control during lag spikes. Now, I need a training dummy that would stay in combat longer to demonstrate this, but to demonstrate that again, basically say that you wanted to play Conviction, and I'm going to pull my Ethernet cable here, and you wanted to play Conviction, and then the lag started and it didn't go off, and then you went and you did Shield and Spear because you were going to build Restoration. Now, it started lagging, and you see that it started lagging, so you want Conviction to go off before this goes off, otherwise it'll just be wasted. And you'll see, if I press Launch Gambit 1, 2, 3, 4, and then when I plug it in to simulate ending the lag spike, it's going to play Conviction, and it's not going to play Shield and Spear, because I told the queue, here's some new inputs, drop all that I just did before there. Those 4 presses on something new, it's only going to focus on the newest thing you just pressed, and everything before it's going to get dropped. And this allows you to control what's going to happen next after the lag. When there's no lag spike, so like there's no lag spike, the game's not frozen. It's just, there's just a heavy slowdown delay, basically. So things are taking a really long time to play. All you really need to do when that happens is just slow down a bit. So instead of building things really fast like that, you want to just ensure that everything is going to go in right. So basically right there's a perfect example what happened right there. So what happened was I tried to do Spear Shield, Spear Fist, Spear Spear. What happened instead was it did Spear Shield, this didn't go off because of delay, this went off, and now it built it wrong. So if you can see that coming, because it happens suddenly, you can always see it coming, but when you know it's happening, and it's been happening regularly, just have a controlled speed at what you're going to build during that lag, instead of full speed like that. And that'll just save you a lot of frustration with trying to build things really fast like that, and then it doesn't go off right. Like I mentioned earlier, that when I build Dark Before Dawn, I like to hit Spear Spear twice, because I know how often that lag happens and makes it not go off right. And certain things do it more often than not. It's amazing when you play Gambits millions of times over nearly 2 decades how many patterns you'll notice. But certain things, another one is Exaltation of Battle. You might need it and you'll get to here, and then Shield won't go off. So you'll see me hit certain things, and then when I go to play Gambit, I'll literally spam 4, and I just explained why that is. So that explains to you why it is that I'm doing certain things like spamming 4, and I will play certain things multiple times like that, is just because even before the lag got really bad in recent years, there's always been some things that just were jankier than others over time, and it's always been like that. That's nothing new. So you really need to incorporate into your muscle memory as you gain experience to do certain things a certain way to ensure that they're going to go off cleanly. Because even lag aside, like I said, some things are just jankier than others. So it's just about understanding the way things work and being able to do it properly. Alright, now I've got some clips, and this is Isle of Storms T5. and I will be able to explain in real time what I'm doing here. So, start the boss, I immediately go to debuff him with marked and diminished, and you see marked resists here, so I immediately reapply it, though that wasn't really necessary as we have 2 tactical DPS, but just generally good practice to keep your debuffs on them. And I'm tearing up battering strikes here and getting off fire at will, and majority of this fight is just purging dots and self-healing pretty much, and protecting the DPS as much as you can. Now right here, the boss is turned because he has started his random aggro on one of the DPS. So basically at this point, I don't need to be tanking anymore. I don't have a dot on me right now, so I just go into DPSing to help move the boss's health down more while one of the DPS has to go kite. And after I put my dots on here, I'm going to put off a group heal to help support them, and I'm going to put off my group protect just in case they couldn't make it away, but they made it away, so it's fine. And I'm putting my heals back up, preparing for the boss to come back after me, but he has decided he wants to random aggro to the other DPS now, so pretty much just help sustain, and I'm going to restore my power here. And you could just be putting more dots out at range with Assailment here, but I chose to just be annoyed that it double aggroed to DPS with the random aggro ability. And here it's finally going to come back to me again. So I'm preparing for it to put dots on me. I'm reapplying my debuffs. I'm getting my hots back up. I'm not really worrying about getting any of my buffs up for this fight in this case, because this fight is not really hard enough with the burst damage to require it. If you're a new player and you're trying to do something like this, I would recommend it. But since I know what I'm doing and this fight does not demand that I be fully buffed for it, I can make do without managing my buffs in the background. This was basically just a DPS burn, and I'm going to continue putting my debuffs on it, and I'm going to blow Desperate Combat early to get Desperate Spear so we can finish killing it as fast as possible. There's no need to draw it out longer than it needs to be. So at this point, we're basically just in the middle of burning it down. And as we come around the corner here, I'm going to switch to DPS again just to help kill it. This is a good example of where Warden really shines, is when you don't really need to be tanking anymore and you can just help with the DPS. This is Isle of Storms T5 Boss 2. Now this one, if you're new to this one's trickier. This one actually does have enough damage to demand you be fully buffed. So you're going to see that I am trying to get my buffs up here before it starts, but it's lagging a bit, so some of them don't go off. And as we start the fight, I start with my marked, or my warning shot to taunt, and I am basically multitasking right here to get the rest of my buffs off and debuffs, because I'm behind, because the buffs didn't go off fast enough before the fight started because of lag. So I go into Defiant Challenge, expecting him to turn because I only did one taunt. He comes back to me. And then I'm finishing getting my buffs off and scoring up my debuffs. Oathbreakers are out on the boss. And now I'm going to start keeping my hots up before any bursts come in, like that right there. And I'm getting instant ambush ready, the yellow icon right here. I'm getting that ready, so when the boss starts his enrage, I am going to immediately sprint over to where the ads are coming in, and I'm going to tank him there, and that's going to give him a second to drop a couple tiers. So he is enraged. I'm bringing him away from the puddles, and I'm coming to where the ads are coming in. These ads are random aggro, so you want to generate a little bit of aggro on them so they are focused on you, but they are basically going to run around and attack random people, so it is not your job to control them. They're going to hit everything here, including the boss. So I am making sure my buffs stay up. I'm getting my BPE buffs up and keeping my debuffs up. Managing my hots again. On this fight, you really want to keep your health at a healthy amount in addition to keeping your buffs up, because he has multiple bursts he can do. They can be chained, and if they happen while his enrage is on, they can very easily one-shot you. So it's absolutely valid. If you need to kite here, you can kite until that enrage goes down, but if you use your cooldowns intelligently, you can tank him in place without getting one-shot. And I use Never Surrender here as a precaution, as we're getting low on the boss, so I'm starting to play a little bit fast and loose here, and I'm basically just going to keep my debuffs on him, and we're going to burn it down. I'm putting Desperate Spear on, and more adds are coming in, and I just want to basically solidify my position here so I know I'm going to stay alive for the next 20 or so seconds so they can finish this. And by this point, my buffs have basically gone down or are about to go down, and I am surviving solely off of my cooldowns and healing at this point, but the boss is almost dead, so it's okay. So as long as you are managing your heals and your buffs, you're going to be extremely tanky. And even against a boss that can potentially chain skills and one-shot you in some cases, if you combine all that with cooldowns, you can plant your feet in one place and tank a tremendous amount of damage. This is Isle of Storms T5 Boss 3, so this fight is pretty chill, especially for Warden. You don't really need to use buffs in the background here, and you barely even need to heal, but you are mainly going to focus on removing corruptions, healing the DPS, and keeping debuffs in the boss. And the main difficulty here is just all the moving pieces, pretty much. But this is standard start, cycle, force taunts, get debuffs on target, group heal, and we're going to Oathbreaker here, get as much damage on the boss as possible. And periodically I just throw up a group heal, and I switch into Assailment in a second here, and this is one of the places where Assailment really shines and shows where its uses are. So, boss is about to do its spam push, so we go behind the stone pillar here, and every time we go behind a pillar, I will just put off a conviction to keep the DPS healed up, and I'm going to use rapid techniques to spam corruption removal here, so we can get it down even faster. But this is one of the fights where Assailment really shines, because in order to move around and not get power sapped by the tornadoes, you have to kind of constantly be moving around, and it typically puts you out of melee range of the boss. So it makes Assailment really nice because you can still use pretty much the entirety of the class, and you don't have to worry about being out of range. And pretty much the entirety of the movement I'm doing is just a position so the captain can get in the range. Now, the boss is going to do his pull here, and as you can see over there, Thunder Buddy does not care about the storm. We use the last 2 ticks to re-engage quickly and debuff the boss. But as I was saying, majority of my movement here is pretty much just to facilitate the captain, and if you have any melee DPS, you're pretty much moving around to put the melee DPS in position to hit the boss. If you have only ranged DPS, you don't really need to worry about it, and you just walk in a short circle basically to not get power sapped. Throw up my group protect here, and we're going to try to burn the rest of the boss health off. And here you'll see I'm going to do rapid techniques and spam conviction here to get everyone back into fighting shape so we can go out and finish the rest of the boss off. Again, not a very hard fight. This is Store Vagoon T2. Now, I considered just cutting this from the video entirely because there's a big lag spike in the middle of this fight, but I figured it would be a good example of how to deal with lag, how to play with it, and this video has some other useful lessons in it as well. So I start off here with pre-buffs already done, but you don't technically need them for this fight. The main difficulty of this fight is just dealing with the constant adds, and basically the boss has a random aggro he can do where he'll run around and hit random people, but if you advance the stage fast enough by doing a lot of DPS, which you're going to see happens here, he basically cuts himself out of that, and every so many percent of his health, more adds are going to spawn and come in, and it's, well, you'll see. So I start with a resounding challenge to build aggro, but the DPS has already started up way too fast on him, so I immediately go to warning shot to threat copy, put my debuffs on him. One resists, I reapply it as fast as I can. Second force taunt out, aggro is mine at this point. And now I'm going to put out a baseline heal, and I'm going to take these two adds that come in here. There will be giants in the back of the area that throw rocks. These can be pretty much ignored. They don't do very much damage at all anymore, so you don't really need to concern yourself with it, but if you want, you can taunt them as well. And here comes the first adds, and you see, I get double punted the moment they come in, which is the worst possible time. So I run straight in, and I burn rapid techniques to use Exaltation of Battle and take immediate aggro off of them. And I use Fierce Resolve as well, and then I follow up with Defiant Challenge. And at this point here, pretty much my only concern is because the boss is nearly half dead, so it's clear that we're just nuking this, and I don't need to worry about my buffs or even my heals really. And I am just solely going to be focusing on managing the adds pretty much and keeping debuffs up as much as I can. So at this point, you don't really control how fast this is going to go. And fortunately, I know the healer, and I know they are very good, and they are going to keep the group up at high health. And with their heals on me, I basically don't even need to do anything for myself. I'm just going to be focusing on managing the aggro of the mobs here. And you'll see this is where the lag spike started, and I'm trying to build Resounding Challenge and Exaltation of Battle, which is not happening. So right here at this point, all the mobs right here are where I want them, but these three, which one is about to come over, so these two over here, they got hit by some AoE from the DPS, so there's more aggro on them than what my ranged aggro can produce now. So at this point, I need to come around and take them more closely, but the problem is lag again. So nothing that I want to be using here is going off or working. And then as I come over, I get stunned, but these mobs are already dead. They've already been blasted by AoE, so it's not even a problem. So I come back over, and like I said, at this point, I'm just trying to maintain aggro of adds coming in. and it's not that hard. It's just the problem is when you've got the lag and the stuns alternating, it can be hard to hit them all at the appropriate time, because once DPS has hit the mobs, they have more aggro than you until you force taunt pretty much. Now right here, before I got stunned, I got resounding challenge off. So all the mobs came to me, and then I get exaltation of battle off, and then I've got plenty of aggro pretty much. And pretty much the rest of this fight is just exaltation of battle and resounding challenge, because they're just going to nuke the boss. All I have to do is just keep control of ads. And more ads are coming in here, and you see I get silenced, but I have another debuff in front of it. So I try to cure it, and it doesn't work because it only takes the oldest one. So I have to go for my fear pot. So I build resounding challenge and I go for the fear pot, get resounding challenge off, get defiant challenge off, and then the mobs are mine, and we just finish the boss. So that is not how fast you're supposed to do that fight, but it can be done that fast. And a good lesson to learn from this is that DPS controls the gas, tank controls the steering wheel. So you better be good at steering when they floor the pedal. At this point, I am out of hard drive space, so I can't really add anything else to the video, and I don't have a whole lot of time left anyway, so even if I had anything else put in a video, don't really have the ability to right now. I wish I had started on this a year ago. I would have had a lot more footage and interesting things to put in, so I hope this was enough. I hope that this was able to help someone, and even if it just helped one person, I feel that it was worth it to make this video. So if anyone has any questions in the comments, I will try my best to answer them within however much time I have after I upload this video. Shortly after I upload the video, I'm probably not going to have internet for the foreseeable future, so I will do my best to answer what I can while I can see it.